Thank you. Good evening. It's great to be here in Mount Hermon. Last night, I slept in a castle. How many of you know of the Navigators? I was in Glen Erie, Colorado last night with about 50 pastors under the age of 40. And they let some old dudes come to hang out. And they don't want you to talk to them. They say, why don't you just sit at this table and have like Starbucks and we'll just ask questions. I say, you don't want me to give a speech? They say, no, please don't give a speech. Just sit down. So it's, that's a different world. And I love that. And it's great to be back at Mount Hermon. It was an easy trip getting here. I had one slight mishap that I'll just tell you about. Sitting in Denver Airport this morning, chewing on a bagel, I popped a crown off of my front tooth. So I'm not going to smile at all while I'm here. Otherwise, it'll scare the bejeebers out of you. So we'll try not to go there. Most of you do not know me from a post. And you've been spared up until this moment. But let me just give you a snapshot. I was born on St. Patrick's Day, 1942. I'll give you just a moment to do that math. That means I'm 70 years and 7 weeks old. I never thought I'd be this old. Some of you know, so I can tell. Some of you know that feeling. And when I was 3.5, I was born in Alameda, California. When I was 3.5, my parents went as missionaries to India after the Second World War. So when I'm standing up here with suitcases that look like this, I know the real deal about this. I know about steamer trunks and sitting on the deck of ships and doing the steamer rug or whatever they call those things over your legs and all of that. Came back, brought up in Oakland, graduated high school there, went to Cal Berkeley when I was 17. I sensed that I didn't stay. No, I didn't. I wasn't smart enough to stay. No. I sensed some kind of urging to ministry when I was a teenager, but I was a severe stutterer. And I stuttered horribly or well, depending on how you view that. And so I decided that I'd be a doctor, because, not do this, because doctors don't have to talk, they just cut on people. So I went to Cal Berkeley. I got 5 units of D in Chemistry 1A my first semester and decided not to inflict myself upon you. So transferred to this little college that used to be right over here at Bethany University and married a young woman named Ruth 6 weeks out of school. Went to Wheaton Grad School, came back, wanted to go to India as a missionary, ended up doing a church plant at the University of Illinois. The background we come from, you have to be a senior pastor before you go overseas, at least back in that day, and stayed at the University of Illinois for 11 and a half years. Then came back and was president here for a few years, and then went to D.C. So I got Alden Johansson's joke. I got that one, what it is. And then 4 years ago came to Fort Collins, Colorado. But I've had the great privilege of cycling through Mount Hermon every now and again. Always impressed by the team that has been spoken of tonight. Always impressed by the people I know who were shaped by this place. And I get to speak tonight and tomorrow morning. And if I could give you a gift about Mount Hermon, and you could give this gift to me, as a matter of fact. But if I could give you a gift tonight, I'd like to give you the gift of perspective. One of the things about getting older is that your perspective adjusts. For me to stand here is one view. For me to just step over here a few feet, this is a little different view. For me to step down, besides throwing off the PA system a little bit, this is different. And if I come down here, this is, but I'm only like 5 feet from where I was. But it's a very different view. Little kids, preschoolers, they have a whole different perspective. I mean, they're like 2.5 feet high. They're running around in a world of kneecaps. They're just... Ruth and I have been married 49 years in July. We have 4 children, 11 grandchildren. The eldest will be 21 this summer, and the youngest is 2.5. But when the eldest was 3, we were visiting out here on the coast She came and crawled in bed with us about 5:30 in the morning. Now, if you're a parent and the 3-year-old comes and crawls in bed, you're saying, oh, and they're usually wet. And but if you're a grandparent, and they crawl in bed, it's cool, And so she said, I want to talk. So you're scrambling up out of the darkness, and you say, okay, let's talk. What do you want to talk about? She said, I'm going to have a baby sister. Her mom was pregnant, but they didn't know the sex of the child. And I said, well, it could be a brother. She said, yeah, but I want a sister. I said, okay. Why don't we think of some names? She said, okay. I said, why don't we call the baby Boogaloonie? Now, this shows how kids think. Kids have a totally different perspective. Why don't we call the baby Boogaloonie? And she looked at me. I said, how about Zonga Bonga Wonga? She started to chuckle. I said, why don't we call the baby Yabba Slavovich? And she just looked at me and howled and said, oh, Grandpa, those are boy names. And if you think kids have a different perspective, you ought to try Jesus. Dorothy Sayers, British mystery writer in the same era as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, said it this way: to do them justice, the people who crucified the Christ did not do so because he was a bore. Quite the contrary. He was too dynamic to be safe. It has been left for later generations to muffle up that shattering personality and surround him with an atmosphere of tedium. One of the great things about coming to Mount Hermon, first time I read that quote, I said, man, I wish I'd said that. One of the great things about coming to Mount Hermon is that Jesus is lifted up here, not just in this place, on hikes, on the canopy tour, I'm sure, and on all the things that are done. And when you lift Jesus up, Scripture says, he'll draw all people to him. And if you don't clutter him with other stuff. If it's just Jesus, he is the most magnetic person that ever walked the planet. If you were to go with Alden and me to Washington, D.C., and drive up Independence or Constitution Avenue, and you get up by the Capitol and turn on First Street and go behind, there's a beautiful building that is the Library of Congress. There are 6 other buildings that are part of the Library of Congress. They have tens of millions of pieces of information, 40 million volumes. There are more books about this 33-year-old Jewish carpenter rabbi executed by the state 2,000 years ago. There are more books about him in the United States Library of Congress than any other person. Abraham Lincoln and Napoleon are a distant seconds. And I'm asking why. You say, well, it's our Puritan roots. And I think it's more than that. I think that this Jesus is the most, I know that this Jesus is the most powerful, most insightful, most disturbing leader that ever walked the planet. There have been great leaders on the planet, some good and some bad. Some of the best leaders were terrible people. They were nevertheless leaders. But nobody led like Jesus, because Jesus changes the human heart. And this place, Mount Hermon, is committed to presenting the Jesus, to exemplifying the Jesus who changes the human heart. Whether you're a 10-year-old kid here trying to learn Jesus while you're hating girls, I'm just telling you, I just told you the truth there. When you're 10 and you're a boy, that's kind of how it is. Or whether you're a university student who comes here for a retreat, or a retired person who comes here. There are people who walk into this place, into this space, who have never, ever heard about this Jesus. And many hundreds and thousands have walked away totally transformed, or at least on the journey of transformation. I looked up Mount Hermon on Google, like the Mount Hermon, not this Mount Hermon, the Mount Hermon. And of course, It's on Google, so we know it's true. And Mount Hermon is in a cluster. It's the end of a cluster of a mountain range that straddles northern Israel above Dan, the town of Dan, 20 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It straddles northern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It's a disputed area. The highest peak is 9,230 feet. It's the highest peak in the whole range, and in the wintertime, it gets snow on Mount Hermon. Syrians have built a ski resort now on Mount Hermon, going to build another one. But when I think of that Mount Hermon, I think of two things, and I'd like to sort of emphasize that in these next few moments. I think of perspective, and I think of nurture. Because when the snows melt on Hermon and it runs down and the waters run in and form the Jordan River, it waters that whole area. It nurtures the whole area. So when you stand on Mount Hermon, you can see the whole region. You have an angle of repose, as one of our theology professors used to say. And you're standing in a place that nurtures the whole area. I believe that's what this Mount Hermon does. I love coming to a place where there have been generations of people come. I love coming to a place where Jesus is lifted up. When you read Acts, the 4th chapter, and the 13th verse, this is how it reads about Peter and John. Now, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus. Jesus leaves, goes back to heaven, and he says, go wait in Jerusalem for the promise of the Father. They've got 10 days, they're just hanging out. What do you do when your leader is gone like that and you're hanging out for 10 days, not knowing what to expect? I'm just guessing that part of what they did was to reminisce. Do you remember when he did that thing with the mud in the eye? You know, with that guy that was healed. Do you remember that? One guy says. And the other person says, do you remember when he had us sit all 5,000 or maybe 10,000, because that was just a minute, down and organize them all? You know what a hassle that was? There were just a dozen of us. We're trying to get all those people to sit down in groups of 50 and 100 so he could break the bread. And somebody says, Peter, I'll never forget you getting out of the boat, walking about 12 feet, and bam, down you go. And Peter's saying, I didn't see anybody else getting out of the boat. You know how it is when somebody who was here and is gone, and you start recalling that this place is full of that. Some of you are sitting here saying, I remember the first time I walked onto these grounds. It didn't look like this. The dining commons wasn't like that. The lodgings were not like they are now. Some of you say, I remember when my son that was struggling in high school came to camp here. And I sent my boy here. We sent our boy here, and a different kid came home. Some of you can say, I made a commitment to Jesus. I decided to give as much as I knew of me at 9 years old to as much as I could understand of Jesus. And I did it on these grounds in this place. Now, we're a people, I believe, that say, the whole planet's going up in smoke one of these days, so don't get too tied to territory or to land or to buildings because, they'll go away. But I have a friend who says when good things happen in a house, it gets into the walls. Friendly gets into the walls when friendships are formed. And on these grounds, eternal business has been done for decades, and you've been a part of it. And even though I haven't had the privilege until the last 20 years of really being a part of it, just for my 2 cents worth, I'd like to say thank you for all that has happened in that way. I can remember as president of the college over there, every once in a while I'd wander into the chapel during the day, and there'd be an older couple there, like in their 50s. And they say, we graduated from here in 1952, and we had four-masted dreams, and we wanted to go out and do some stuff, and some of that stuff we've done, and some of it just hasn't worked. But we were driving through, and we wanted to come back to this place, because in this chapel, on that seat, on a Thursday night during a mission service, Jesus touched my life. And we just wanted to come back and say, we know that at that point in time, the Almighty God spoke to me, and he has been faithful, and I have found that in Christ alone all this comes together. That's what I found. First time I ever met Richard Halverson, former chaplain of the United States Senate, was here. I was president of Bethany, and they had a thing for lunch, and I'd read a little of him and heard of him, and then a number of years later, I go to D.C. in 1993, and I get to sit with him every few weeks. And we're sitting in the Senate dining room, and I met him here, right? We're sitting in the Senate dining room, and I'm a kid from East Oakland, California. And East Oakland doesn't look anything like the Senate dining room. Just want you to know that. I'm just grateful to be alive. You know what I'm saying? And I asked him, I said, how do you work with senators? And he said, my first church was in Coalinga, California. Anybody know where Coalinga? Well, clearly you do. You got to want to go to Coalinga, And he said, most of the women in the church, most of the people in the church were women who wanted me to quote, get their husbands saved. That's the language he used. He said, but none of the guys were there, and so I had to go find them. They're wildcat oil riggers, car salesmen, bankers. He said at the end of 4 years, most of them were following Jesus. And he said, I found out two things about working with business leaders. One was you had to go where they were. And the second was you had to respect their time, because time was money. So when I came to the United States Senate, I determined I'd meet a man anywhere, anytime, under any circumstance, at his convenience, with no agenda except his. And I said, yeah, but you've got an agenda. And I'm trying not to gawk because Henry Kissinger's over in the corner. And I said, you've got an agenda. You want that person to come to Jesus. And he looked at me and grinned and said, oh, no, Dick. That's not my agenda. That's my life. The difference between whether Jesus is your agenda or your life is whether the person you're talking to feels like a target or feels like a friend. It says Jesus, the one we follow, is the friend of sinners. I love that because that means I get in. And so when I look at that, I say, I met Dick Halverson here. That's where our connection started, was here at Mount Hermon. I got to work with him for 3 or 4 years before he went home to the Lord. It was here that I saw those two great pianists. I think it was at Christmas time, Nielsen and Young. Any of you know those guys? They can play the piano almost as good as Dave Talbot. It's unbelievable. It was here I first heard Buddy Green play the harmonica. There is a place. This is a place in which people can catch a vision of Jesus. And when they catch a vision of Jesus, they catch a vision of his world. This is his world here. We go from Mount Hermon to Bangladesh. You go from Mount Hermon to Berlin. You go from Mount Hermon to Tierra del Fuego down in Latin America. You go from Mount Hermon to Alaska. You go from Mount Hermon to Hong Kong. The Jesus we follow knows all those places. The Jesus we follow is in all those places. And people go from Mount Hermon there to essentially say, Jesus, what would you like to do in Hong Kong? Could I do that with you? This idea that people catch a vision at a place like this is profound. When people catch a vision, it changes everything. Billy was 6 years old, lived in Chicago,
when his mother said, "Why don't you write down what you would like to be when you grow up?" said to all of her kids. And Billy wrote, "I want to be an honest man when I grow up, a true and loving and kind and faithful man." When he was 8 years old, his mom took him. His father was not a believer, but his mom took him to Moody Church in Chicago. And there was a fellow there speaking, pastoring by the name of R.A. Torrey. And that day he gave an invitation to come to Jesus. And Billy, in his sailor suit, gave as much as he knew of himself to as much as he could understand of Jesus, committed his life to Jesus. When he was 16, his parents sent him around the world. His dad wanted him to get a good view of the world because his father was a millionaire and led one of the largest companies in the United States at that time. And when Billy came back, he was profoundly changed because he had seen the poor and the desperate and the lost. When he was 17 in 1905, he enrolled at Yale. His last name was Borden, and he was heir to the Borden dairy fortune. His father died his freshman year, but by that time, Bill was already a millionaire. His roommate and he decided to have a prayer time before breakfast, just a little prayer. Turned into a Bible study, other people joined. And by the end of his freshman year, there were 150 students at Yale University in Bible studies. Along the way, during his undergraduate career, he built a home for the disenfranchised over in between New Haven and Bridgeport, I think, so for the downtrodden and the alcoholics and all of that. By the time he came to his senior year, because of Bill Borden, 1,000 students out of 1,300 students at Yale were in Bible studies because Billy Borden had caught a vision of Jesus and people who needed him and what might happen if those two connected. A speaker came his senior year by the name of Samuel Zwemer, who worked with Muslim folks. And he decided, Bill Borden did, that he wanted to go to China, a particular area of China, and work with Muslims. And I'll tell you the rest of that story at the end in just a moment. So this is a place where you catch a vision. It's also the place where people are nurtured. I had the privilege of going to Wheaton Grad School back in 1963, and I had a professor by the name of Dr. Lois Labar. She stood about this tall, maybe about that tall, single lady, mid-60s, PhD from NYU, best teacher I ever had. I created a Sunday school curriculum, and she came and sat in my Sunday school class every Sunday for 13 Sundays in the fall of 1964. And I would go to her house, and we'd work on the curriculum together, and she'd ask me questions. And I was writing a thesis, and she said, "Are you going to go to the Urbana Conference?" Because it was a missions thesis. And the Urbana Conference is sponsored by InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Some of you are aware of the conference every 3 years. I said, "I'd love to go, but it's so expensive." Like it's $50 for the whole week. And, Ruth was making $50 a week working at the college. And I said, and I wouldn't go without Ruth anyway. And Lois Labar got up and walked into the back room, came back out and took my hand, opened it up, and laid 5 brand new $20 bills in my hand and said, "You take Ruth and go to Urbana." That $100 changed the trajectory of my entire life. $100 can change the trajectory of somebody's life when it's invested in the right time and the right place, and that's how it is. We talked about camps, retreats, and she would teach out of this text a lot, Acts 2, verses 42 through 46. Many of you are familiar with this text. This is after the day of Pentecost and after Peter's talk where he preaches for 3 minutes and like 3,000 people come to Jesus. And I have a friend who says that I have people who talk forever and nobody comes to Jesus. But this Peter preached for just a few minutes. And verse 42 says, "And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching," that is, who is this Jesus, and fellowship, being together, and the breaking of bread and prayer. She called those things the wife principles. Breaking of bread, she took to be communion types of things. I think it's probably a larger meal than that, but she saw that as worship. Who is this Jesus, the apostles' teaching? That's instruction. Fellowship is fellowship, and prayer is expression, the wife principles. She said in most congregations, depending on what service or what activity you go to, you get one or more of those. So in a Sunday morning service, you might have worship and music, and then you have instruction. But then you go to the potluck to have fellowship, and then you go to the prayer meeting to have prayer. But when you come to a place like this for a weekend or for a week, you get all four of those things compacted together in an intense way. And as a young pastor, I was preaching my heart out. I was just doing everything I knew how to do. And people would go away to a retreat at a place like Mount Hermon for 2 days, and they'd come back like revolutionized. And I'd say, so like, what did the guy talk about? And they told me, and I'd been talking about that for 6 months. And he like just did 3 talks, and bang, it went. And I grappled with that, saying, why does that happen? I think it happens because of the wife principles being intense. We're away from our natural environment. We're here in this. It's a place of nurture and investment and caring. So, Mount Hermon is a place where you get perspective. Mount Hermon is a place where you get nurtured. Mount Hermon is a place that just doesn't bring people in. Over time, people go out. People go on mission. That's what this day is about. This 36-hour period or 24-hour period is about impact. What does that look like? How does that work? Bill Borden decided to go to the north of China, or to this area in China. He felt along the way that he should learn Arabic so he could understand the Quran and talking to the folks he was going to talk to. So he went to Cairo. He was there 3 months and got spinal meningitis. Bill Borden is buried in the American Cemetery in Cairo, Egypt. He was 25 when he died. Never got to the place that he thought he was going. But his wake, and I don't mean wake like sitting around mourning, I mean the wake of his vessel created ripples out from which went thousands of others. There was another missionary friend who, when hearing of his death at age 25, and somebody had said, it's sad to see a life cut short. And the person's response was, when your life is fully surrendered to Jesus, it can never be cut short. It will be just right. And some of those years are 25, and some are 55, and some are 70, and some are 92. But the fact is that when people get to know us, you, the Bill Bordens of the world, will their observation be, he has this pedigree or that documentation, or she has those skills? But the most impressive thing, the most magnetic thing, is that he or she has been with Jesus. If I be lifted up, I will draw all people to me. For me, that's what this place, that's what you friends are about. It doesn't get more impacting than that. Father, thank you for these moments together. Thank you for your grace. Thank you that in you we find who we are, and we get to trust you, and then we get to listen and find what it is we're supposed to do. Thank you for the thousands, multiplied thousands of people who have had their lives transformed because of this place and this team and these friends. What a joy it is to see what happens when we follow you together. In Jesus' name. And everyone said,